Marriage and missions. In this series, we're going to talk with families about how they use the influence of their marriage to support the missions efforts of their local church. That's up next on this episode of the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast.
Welcome to the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast, where families are equipped to reflect God's redeeming love. And now, here's your host, Jared Lambert.
Welcome once again to the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast, where families are equipped to reflect God's redeeming love. I'm your host, Jared Lambert. Thanks again for joining us, checking in, and listening to the podcast. We are in the middle of our Marriage and Missions series, and this special episode is another first for the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast. This is the first time we are recording in Honduras, and we are recording with a couple from Honduras. Joining us on this episode is Larry and Allison Smoak. We'll hear more about them, but just want to remind you of what we're doing this series. In this series, we're speaking with couples who have used the influence of their marriage to support the missions efforts of the local church. We've talked to some couples connected back home in Baton Rouge at Healing Place Church. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to get a variety of families, a variety of ministries. We wanted to talk to some people who are serving internationally. We want to talk to some people who are serving right in their hometown or in their region. We want to talk to some, people who are simply just plugged into their church, whatever they're doing with the gifts God give them to help support the missions effort of the local church. So again, on this episode, we're joined by Larry and Allison Smoak. Larry, Allison, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us. How are you guys doing?
Glad to be here. We're doing just fine, thanks.
Okay, so got a great story. I'm going to go ahead and let Larry introduce the family and tell us how they got to Honduras.
Yeah, we have been married 10 years. We have 4 kids, 3 girls and a boy, 7, 5, 3, and 1. So all together there, two years apart. And we have a Honduran adopted son who's 37, but is slightly disabled to where his mind is that of a child, but he's wonderful. His name is Joel. And that's our family. We live here in Honduras. And I came to Honduras through Jack Dyer, who was connected with Healing Place Church. Came in the 70s and was a missionary here and invited me to come down and work with young people, discipling, and kind of be director of a discipleship center that we still lead here in Honduras.
Right.
And that was in 1994.
Mm-hmm. And where were you before that?
Before that, I had only been a year out of college paying off some loans.
Right. Now, you were brought up as a missionary child, as a missionary kid, right? The son of missionaries.
That's right. My parents, Tom and Betsy Smoak, were missionaries in Colombia, South America, with Wycliffe Bible translators. I was born in Colombia and lived there till I was 14, and then we moved to the States.
Right. Awesome. So how did you guys end up meeting?
Let Allison tell you that.
I came down on a water project in 2006 with my church. They do 2 water projects a year to provide clean drinking water for villages in southern Honduras where they don't have access. And I came down and had absolutely no idea why I was coming and what the purpose of my being there was. And on the second day, I met Larry Smoak, very famous missionary to the people at our church because so many had gone on water projects and known him and respected him. And I was a single woman, and I thought, well, he's single, and there was nothing there. And then 2 days later, he was doing teaching, and I didn't know any Spanish at all, and so I was praying for the people and felt like God said, he's going to be your husband. And I didn't believe God and said, that's just crazy because he's a missionary and there is no way I'm going to be a missionary. So it's just not going to work out. But all the circumstances led together and God called me back to Honduras without any doubt. And I came back to serve God, but God brought us together to serve him together too.
Right. So, Allison, if you could Tell a little bit about your upbringing. Want to talk about your personal salvation testimony, and then how you were connected to the church, which led to coming on a missions trip, to Honduras.
Sure. My family grew up. I grew up in the church. My family always went to church, and when I was about 5, I went to Vacation Bible School and did the acceptance prayer at that point. And I always had the appropriate fear of God and desire to live in a way that honored Him. But it really wasn't until I was a youth leader when I was about 23 or so, and I had to go on an adventure trip, and I hated being outside. I never went outside. So the thought of going in a canoe and sleeping in tents and it just absolutely frightened me. But I loved the kids, and so I said I would go. And through that process, God showed me that I was able to do more than I thought I was able to do. And I learned that I actually had to depend on Him, even sometimes for the next step that I was going to take on a hike. So in 2006, kind of that eye-opening moment where I really started to change the way I lived and to live differently was when I found out about fair trade, not free trade. And I realized that with my buying choices, I could either help people in the world or I could oppress people in the world. And so that gave me such an eye-opening experience to what was going on in the world, because I lived in a tiny little bubble. I grew up at the church. I started working at the church. I went to seminary and got a job at the church.
Where were you born and raised?
Sorry, in Burnsville, Minnesota. Just south of Minneapolis.
Awesome.
And so I literally spent my entire existence with college and grad school within a 45-minute radius of where I was born. So to have my thoughts go even outside of Minnesota, having rarely even traveled, was very important for my vision of who God was and who the kingdom, what His kingdom would look like, and who His people are.
Gotcha. So Larry, we already talked about how you grew up in a missionary family, being around the Word, being around godly parents. So tell us about your salvation testimony.
Mm-hmm. Sure. My parents were both strong believers and very intentional at raising their kids as disciples of Jesus, and I'm very thankful for that. They, of course, made their own mistakes, but we were taught the Word from early on. And at 7 years old, even before that, the Lord started speaking to me. And as a child, say 4 or 5, I remember just hearing this voice and knowing this person was speaking to me and didn't think anything unusual about it. Oh, that's God.
Mm-hmm.
But then at 7, I heard a sermon about hell and got scared and said, I got to make a choice. I got to make a decision. And so I did. And I believe that was a real decision, but unfortunately it was more about fear of hell than loving God.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was a process of growing to understand what it all meant. And then when I was in college, I was about 21, I kind of got to the bottom of myself for the first time.
Right.
And I realized I can't please God. I can't work hard enough to please God. I have to depend on God's mercy and His grace.
Yeah.
And that was a changing moment for my life. So really grew from that experience a lot.
Yeah, I think, the development of our walk of faith and in our salvation really should impact the way we minister and treat other people. When we know that when we've been rescued and we weren't even looking for the life ring,
right?
That ought to affect the way we minister and interact with other people. I know, sharing my story, God was very patient with me. Always involved in church, and I thought like I was checking the marks off checking the boxes to make sure everything was right. The scales of justice. I was trying to do more good things than bad things, but just like you said, even on our best day, it doesn't amount to anything in His eyes according to His holiness. So it's just really important to really understand the gospel, and if you're going to effectively minister and effectively reach people for Christ.
You're right. And when I was in high school and in college, I was involved in missions already. I knew that I was called to be a missionary since I was 12, and I went forward and committed my life to missions wherever God wanted me. And so I started being involved in missions in high school, college, but it was out of my own effort. It was something hard that I knew I should do, and I was doing it for God. There was no joy in it. So then when God got me just to rock bottom and say, you can't do it. You don't have anything. And I realized that for the first time. I was on my face for a couple weeks just weeping and crying and saying, God, I don't know where to go from here because I've been trying and that's all I know. And he said, well, it's just me. It's just me doing it.
Yeah.
After that, I had so much joy in reaching out. I started going down to the inner city of Chicago. I was at Wheaton College and started going to the inner city of Chicago on Friday nights and just loving it, just sitting in the train station talking to people about Jesus, and had such great joy. Yeah. That was a new thing for me.
Gotcha. Yeah, so all that led to you guys answering the call to the mission field. So, Allison, back to when you came on the missions trip and you were serving here in Honduras and you saw him teaching and you heard from God. How did it progress from there?
Well, I went home and told people I'm quitting my job and I'm moving to Honduras, and everyone told me, you're crazy and you're chasing an experience and you shouldn't do that. But I absolutely knew that God had called me to come back to Honduras, and so I did. I actually went into my boss and told him, and he actually did say, you're crazy, but good luck. And so that was exciting. But I came down and I started working at Instituto El Rey, which is the local high school that is run by missionaries up here. And I just came back, and I didn't really even have a plan. I didn't have a teaching license. I didn't speak Spanish. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I just knew that God wanted me here. And so I was obedient to that. And then I would come down to campus where we live now, and I would spend the weekends with Larry and another missionary who was visiting. And we would hang out with the little kids, and we'd take them swimming, and we'd feed them a snack, and we'd just hug them and play games. And I had never felt so alive before in my life. Yeah. I had never felt like I actually had a purpose before that was worthwhile. And so I just kept saying, God, I know that you're here, and I am not pursuing Larry at all. I am here to pursue you. And if you want anything else to happen, I'm content to be here single, but I'm really starting to like Larry. And so if you want to bring things together, that'd be great too.
Okay. All right. So what happened next? That was kind of a cliffhanger there.
So I waited for about 1.5 years. And then Papa Jack came to visit, actually. And we had a conversation with him for about 2, maybe even 3 hours. And then as I went to go get something from the house, he turned to Larry, and I'll let Larry tell this part.
Yeah, I had been, let me just backtrack a little bit. Yeah. I had been here for 14 years as a single missionary. Came down when I was 25, wanting to be married, but knew the Lord was leading me to Honduras. And praying for a wife, and different ones would come and go, and it just wasn't the one. And then when Allison came, of course, I asked, Lord, is this the one? And I didn't sense that it was at all. But then she came back, and then she started visiting, and we started doing ministry together. And and yet and we really grew to be friends and ministry partners in a beautiful way. Yeah. But I didn't have the romantic feelings or anything like that. But then Jack Dyer visited, and we talked, and Allison stepped away for a moment. He said, hey, what do you think? She's a good catch, basically.
I could hear him say it too.
And I said, you're right. I just don't have those feelings that it seems like you should have if you're going to ask somebody to marry you. Well, interestingly, from that point on, those feelings started growing.
Right, yeah.
And it was about 3 months later that I was so sure. I said, Lord, I want to be so sure that I don't want to have to ask the question anymore. Is she the one? Right. And I got to that point. Yeah. And about 3 months later, I asked her if she would marry me.
Awesome. So, and that was 10 years ago,
That was 10 years ago.
4 children ago.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about your time here on the mountain in Honduras. What would you say is one way that the mission field and your ministry here has influenced and strengthened your marriage?
That's a good question, because I really, in 10 years, I see that marriage is so much more about, it's God's instrument to conform us to Christ.
Absolutely, yep.
And so the mission field also conforms you to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And you put missions plus marriage together,
Mm-hmm.
and you got a double,
Double
conforming.
crucible.
Double crucible. That's right. Jack Dyer used to call the anvil.
Yeah.
And you're on the anvil, and marriage is kind of an anvil. And so you can't believe the Hollywood romantic stories. Marriage is tough.
Yeah.
But it's all to lead us to holiness and
Right.
conforming to Christ. And then you add missions into that mix.
Mm-hmm.
And especially missions where we live in the countryside with fewer resources,
Yeah.
among the poor, and we try to live similarly to the poor. There's a lot of things that stretch you.
Yep.
But all of that becomes good
Mhm.
when we say, I need God, and we
Yeah.
run to God, and we learn to trust God through it.
Yeah.
And that's what turns it into a good thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
I also wanted to say that in that there are 5 other ministries here in our valley,
Mhm.
but we're on a dirt road that is in terrible condition, and so we don't have any sort of regular access with all the other couples. We try and get together once a month, but once a month for a couple hours isn't a whole lot.
Yeah.
And so just being by ourselves so much, in one sense, that's really helped to strengthen our marriage, because we're the only friends that we have on a regular basis.
Right.
And so we get to hang out all the time,
Yeah.
and that's good. And then it also helps because just as you have your struggles, you're the only other person to go to talk through them with
Mhm.
you. So that can be difficult when the problem might be the source is the listener.
Right.
But
yeah.
it also really helps because we can't hide anything.
Mhm.
There's no place, there's nothing that we can hide behind, there's no place to go. And so we haven't been able to avoid some of the problems that other people probably do.
Yeah. Yeah, there's not like you said, there's not much hiding it.
Right.
So and you talked about the lifestyle and being here husband and wife, they're I'm gonna make sure I say this the right way. It really takes husband and wife to do everything.
Right.
So you guys are maintaining a household. You guys are raising 4 children and working a ministry. Nobody, it's not like one of y'all can handle one thing.
Right.
So
Right. And so many people in the States that we talk to, they have grandmas and grandpas and aunts and uncles and the
Yes.
neighbors that they can leave their kids with,
Yeah.
And so, you're just it. And so you either have
Exactly.
to take your small children who have nap times and lunch times and a super rigid schedule and drag them everywhere, or just I stay in the house.
Yeah.
And that's been hard because when we started doing ministry together, we were together all the time and
Mhm.
working so intensely together, and that brought us together in a really special way. But then with the kids, I'm in the house and he's doing the ministry, and so it felt like the dichotomy of family versus ministry rather than all doing it together.
Right.
And honestly, we're still working through that because we still have the really little ones.
Right.
So that has been a challenge for us.
Yeah. But like Larry said, it's all meant to conform us. So
Right.
and in my time as a pastoral marriage counselor, the one thing I learned, both of course being married and being encouraged by other mentors in my life, when you're conforming into the image of Christ, that means you're putting your old self to death. And there's nothing pleasant or feels good about putting that sin nature to death. So if you're experiencing some discomfort or what unhappiness is the word I heard often, that might not be something you want to run away from. That might be something you want to lean into, because that is God stripping away those things, that sin nature and that old self, in order so that you could become more like Christ.
Yeah.
And that's not unique to the mission field, but like you said, I believe, with the 3 months that we've been here, with our vast experience of 90 days of being here, we can tell the difference and how much more work and more pressure there is to work together to do things. There aren't the conveniences, so you really have to take advantage of that joy that we have in the Holy Spirit, and that peace and that patience, and that self-control. So you really have to dig into that well and know that you have ready for you the fruits of the Holy Spirit whenever you go through the trying things that happen here, on the mountain and in the mission field.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that was so surprising to me growing up in Minnesota, where you have your doors closed because it's so cold most of the year, is that people are always coming here. There are always people at the gate. There are always people asking for things. And so few, I mean, maybe 3 people come to just hang out. Every other person who comes to the gate is asking for something. And so it's always you just get worn down from the give all the time, and so few people are ever coming to build you up. And so that's another way that you have to have God as your strength, because you're not getting it from any other place.
Gotcha. Yeah. Awesome. All right. So so we talked about how you felt like the mission field influenced and strengthened your marriage. What are some ways that you guys try to use your marriage as you minister to others here on the mountain?
We see, as in probably anywhere in the world, but here there's a pretty poor concept of what a godly marriage is, what a godly man looks like, a godly husband, what a godly woman or wife looks like. There's a pretty poor concept because of just sin through the generations. And so we have realized that simply by being a godly marriage, simply by living in the power of the Holy Spirit to be a godly husband and a godly wife, we are testifying of what Jesus can do and what really what God looks like, because God created man and woman in his image in order to display who he is in different facets of his nature, the masculine nature, the feminine nature that originate in God. And we display that as husband and wife and in our marriage relationship. Yeah. For a while, we had 14 Honduran young people living in our home with us. And that's when it was day in and day out, day and night, 24/7. We just displayed what a marriage was supposed to look like. Yeah. And that was a huge challenge. It gave us the seriousness that it's a huge responsibility to walk out our marriage in a godly way, but a privilege to be able to just let them peek in on our marriage and say, oh, so that's what it could be like if God's in charge. Right. So that's the biggest way I think that our marriage has been part of our ministry. Yeah.
Another way is recently we've been hosting a family discipleship group, as it were. We have 5 couples who have been coming, and we have been talking about marriage from a biblical perspective. But even just as Larry was saying, even just spending time having a meal together, or hanging out and serving one another and talking and sharing some of our everyday experiences, we're helping people see who we are in a transparent way. I think it's just human nature to hide your faults, and so people either rarely talk about the problems that they're having in their families, or they do it in a way that kind of blasts the other spouse, doesn't show respect to them, and So when we are able to be in our Bible study and say, well, Larry and I had this conflict the other day, or Allison and I were having this discussion, and just to be able to share that we have those struggles and here's how we worked it out.
Right.
And I'm sure you guys have had these conversations too, and trying to relate it to people. That's been a really effective way as well.
Yeah, that's transparency has to be a value. Because when you're not transparent and you only talk about what you should be, you're setting up people to fail.
Right.
Because you're not talking, okay, we want to go from 1 to 10. If we only talk about 1, which is good, we want to talk about our sinful nature and our need, to be saved and our need to be redeemed. And we want to talk about how we need to be holy. But if you're only talking about those two things, you're not giving anybody hope.
Yeah.
Because we're not, depending on where you are, spiritually mature-wise, you may be 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. But if you're not, and especially as pastors and leaders, you have to, not for the sake to relate to others, but just for the sake to give them hope. Yes, we have arguments. Yes, we don't agree. But we know that the in those disagreements is the need for us to come together to cooperate and compromise so that we can walk in unity as husband and wife as God, designed. And so I love the fact that y'all are transparent and you're open about the struggles. That way you're not only talking about how you wake up at 4 o'clock, pray till 6, and kind of like the Sports Center highlights of the Christian marriage, and then couples go home after hearing all these highlights and they're saying, well, we don't measure up.
Right.
Well, nobody measures up, but the growth process is what, as leaders and pastors, that's how we want to shepherd. We want to shepherd people through the growth process, not just talk about where we need to be or where we've been. So I think that's a great that's a great tactic in order to be good ministers and to shepherd people well, is to be transparent.
Right. And since so few people are actually legally married in this culture as well, they mostly just get together when they're younger and probably stay together for a while. And of the group of this that we have, one was that couple that just got married that you posted pictures about on Facebook, but otherwise none of them are legally married. Oh, one other was. That's right. But to be able to say the reason that we can get through some of these conflicts is only because we have that covenant made with God, and that He is the one helping us through that, and that to be able to show that is the example too of that there is a hope, and it lies outside of you, and you need to find that. You need to find Him who is that source of hope to be able to fill you and lead you through these.
Yep. Love it. Okay. All right. So if people want to know more about what you guys are doing here, how can they get in touch? How can they get involved? And how if they want to partner and with you guys with what's going on, how can people get in touch with you guys to learn more about what you guys are doing here?
We have a small website that you can go to and just see the basics of what we do. And you can find that at www.the600, THE600.weebly, weebly.com. And there you'll see some photos and just our purpose and mission and things like that. If you want to contact us personally, we'd be happy to hear from you. You can get on our mailing list. We send out a newsletter every month, an email. And so you could write to us at Larry and Allison Smoak, no spaces, at yahoo.com. And we'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely, yeah. All right, well, we appreciate you guys taking time to join us. It was good to hear from one of the couples here in Honduras. Larry with Larry being here over 2 decades, and you guys experiencing marriage over a decade. It was good to hear what you guys are doing here and how you guys have used, like we talk about, the influence of your marriage to help support the missions effort. So anything you guys have before we wrap up?
I think a word that I have to share is from the beginning, God said, create man in my image, male and female. That means a man and a woman for fruitfulness and dominion. There in Genesis 1. And that to me says missions. That to me is the Great Commission right there. Go into all the world and make disciples. That's fruitfulness. Yeah. And that's dominion of the whole earth. You go out to those dark places. And so marriage is integral to God's plan to spread his kingdom around the world. Yeah.
One of the things we talked about as our heart for this series is that to be able to stir up in our listeners a passion and even a Holy Spirit conviction about whether or not they're doing all they can with what God has given them to support, the mission effort of the local church. Do you guys have, I know you guys are here, but of course you guys have supporters. So what we don't want is we don't want listeners to think I got to sell my house, pack up my stuff, and go somewhere to serve missions. You don't have to do that. So in your experience, what are some other avenues? What are some other ways, maybe some people in your lives that support missions, but they're not quote-unquote missionaries? What are some other ways people can get involved if they're not called to move to a certain country?
Let me start with just a little bit of the personal side for each of us, because marriage is a place to really test whether love is for real. And God is love. And so in your marriage, if you're not finding how love is real, love is a power that works, then you don't really have anything to give to anybody else.
Right.
But when you do in your marriage, and it's tested by fire, I know that, I experienced that, but when you find out that love is for real in your marriage, you have something to give to the world, because that's what everybody's looking for, including your neighbor, including the person asleep on the inner city street, or the person in the darkest unreached country on the other side of the globe.
Yeah, and I think one of the things for me that was the most important was finding the people who are more like the people that Jesus describes in Matthew 25 when he says, the naked, the poor, the imprisoned. Yes, everybody needs Jesus, but those who aren't naked and imprisoned have more of an opportunity for access, or they know where to go for it. They have a different sort of poverty, of course, but sometimes those on the street or in the nursing homes or in the hospitals, in the chronic wards, in the cancer wards, AIDS patients, they don't know or have the resources in order to find it. And so we need to go to them. We need to find those people and to love them, and God will provide the opportunity for the words, but I think that the actions have to come first.
Yeah, as we're talking about, I'm thinking about all the different ways people can get involved, and I think one way to understand how you can get involved is to understand, who you are and where you fit in the body of Christ. And I'm reminded of 1 Corinthians 12, where it talks about the body and how it takes many parts. And we don't want to give glory to some parts over others. So, the last thing we want to do is glorify missionaries, but we want to, know that as missionaries here in Honduras, both for Brandy and I and for Larry and Allison, we couldn't survive without the local church. So just like in 1 Corinthians 12, where the eye can't make it without the feet can't make it without the hands, we can't make it. So and that's what's so beautiful about that Paul's illustration of the body, how it is a living organism, how it is pushing back darkness and gaining ground for God's kingdom. That can only happen with all parts. And it doesn't have to be you moving to another country. It can be you deciding to do an evaluation of what gifts God has given you and see how you can use that under, your spiritual authority and serving your local church.
Yeah, I agree. And the people who have been trained in business and lawyers and you find the way that you can serve and use those gifts for God's glory, and you do it even if it has no spiritual component at all. You do it what's that verse of? You do work everything as to the Lord.
For the glory of God.
Right. Do all things as unto the Lord. And so work at it with all your heart, right?
Yeah.
And that's good. And a lot of times we have people who are doing that as unto the Lord, and then they earn the salary and then support us. And that can be one of the ways that they're working with missions too.
Yeah, being, both Brandy and I are in our mid-40s, and when I look back on our walk, we've been through kind of each step. We got plugged in at Healing Place Church, who is missions is a priority. So from the first time we attended a service, they were talking about missions. We were encouraged early and both decided to support missionaries coming up. And then as we came on staff, we started being exposed even more of a in-depth witness and understanding of what goes on with missions. So we were, able to help missionaries. We were able to support them in many different ways, all leading up. And way back then, we had no idea God's call on our life 17 years later was to move to Honduras. But just thankful, for the church that we've been planted in, how they make missions a priority, and how they encourage us how to be a part. So yeah, it's been great, and I'm sure you guys walk through the same process in order to walk out what God has for you guys here.
Right. And I think with having the vision to be that missionary wherever God has you, using whatever gifts you have, it has to start with the love for God. It has to start in your utter worship and adoration of God, because without that, you're never going to want to support somebody if it's not just checking a box off of the Christian to-do list. Yeah. And so, the person who goes and works as unto the Lord, they're doing it out of an act of worship, and then that is reflected in all the other areas of their lives. Yeah. And I personally believe that as they do that, they're going to find those poor and broken people in their lives, and they're going to start doing it themselves and not necessarily just sending the money.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, all right. Again, want to thank Larry and Allison for taking time to joining us. We talked about how you guys can get in touch with them to find out more about what they're doing here. Excited about this series. Excited about the couples that we've been able to talk with. Excited about the couples we got lined up for future episodes. So, again, Larry, Allison, thanks so much. Appreciate what you guys do. Appreciate you taking time to share your hearts with us today. Thanks again for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
Awesome. All right, that'll do it for this episode. As always, we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast, share with your family and friends, and if you could rate and write a review. When you write a review on the podcast, that gives us the opportunity to know how we can serve you better. That'll do it for this episode. We'll see you next time on the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast.
Thank you for joining us for today's podcast. For more information about Healing Place Church, visit us at healingplacechurch.org. For more podcast episodes, subscribe to the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast on iTunes or the podcast server for your device.